If you could change one thing about the way as a society hire people, what would you change?
Stop caring about people's pedigrees and how fancy the name on their degree is. Get rid of it. I see a lot of people who come from historically marginalized backgrounds who have developed incredible skills outside of the work context, and they think they can't talk about them because they didn't get paid to develop them.
And when I tell this story to other people, they're like, why are you doing that? Don't you want the job? Like, go and change it on the inside. And I'm like, people think they can do it better than you can, or think they already have the answers in lots of respects, or want you to do it in a very specific way that sits within a very specific box. And that's never a job that I really want to have. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another amazing episode of Open to Work. As you all know, we're here to help you navigate this challenging job market, wherever you are in the world, kind of cutting through the noise, cutting through the misinformation, and bringing you genuine, actionable advice that can help you land that next job. We are in the kind of middle of a super exciting series where we're looking at kind of historically marginalized groups and some of the challenges that historically marginalized groups have often had in accessing the job market. So we've had some amazing speakers come on so far, and we're rounding it off really in this kind of trio of episodes with one of my kind of favorite all-time speakers on this topic, a former colleague of mine, Aubrey Blanche-Sarellano, the VP of Equitable Operations at Cultramp. She's the CEO and founder of Mathpath. And yeah, just one of the global leaders probably in diversity and inclusion. And I've had the pleasure of working with her for a couple of years at Cultramp, and we did some fantastic work around equitable design and recruitment. So I'm so excited to be joined by Aubrey today. Hello.
Hey, I'm so excited to be here. It feels like a real pleasure to get to do a little bit of throwback of the work that we did, but also get to talk a little bit about how I think the foundations we built together, we've been able to scale a little bit over the last couple of years.
Oh, I can't wait for the live catch-up that we're all going to see here. And Aubrey may sound and present American, but she's coming into us live from Surrey Hills in Sydney. So a truly global podcast chat happening today.
Yes, I have many identities, but immigrant is one of the newer ones for me. I'm about to hit my 1-year anniversary of living in Australia.
Aubrey, we have a really hard landing here at the Open to Work podcast. We always like to ask everyone the same question, and it's one that they love, and it's an interview question. So Aubrey, as if you were responding to an interview question, tell me about yourself.
So I would say that I'm someone who is incredibly values aligned in the way that I work and the kind of organizations I tend to thrive in. So my kind of core values are equity and justice, integrity, and hopefully a little bit of fun. I think that not everything needs to be so serious, even if it's done correctly. My background is I've spent about the last 10 years in, various equity and now HR focused roles. But I like to think of myself as someone who solves problems rather than has a career. I haven't really found this career on purpose. I'm just really motivated to help people be treated well at work, and kind of whatever my job requires to get to that outcome is something I'm really happy to roll up my sleeves and do.
So from your experiences as a practitioner and a leader in this space, what are kind of some of the ways that historically marginalized groups, and maybe even we should just kind of define that category as well and start off with a definition of what is a historically marginalized groups, and then what challenges in having access to the job market those groups have had?
Yeah, so when we're talking about historically marginalized groups, we're looking at groups who have experienced like social, economic, or political disadvantage in some way. And so this can vary between countries, but there's also a lot of common. So in the West, or in like white dominant countries, you're talking about non-white folks or people of color, often women, people who are disabled, LGBTQ, right? Like if you think about someone who maybe isn't the dominant group in society, that's what we're talking about. And Matthew, something I really, really appreciated that you're doing right now that I want to call out is you're talking about historically marginalized and not underrepresented. And I think that's really important because I think we shy away from saying marginalized. Underrepresented is like the whitewashed thing to talk about. And I think that we actually set ourselves up to make better progress when we talk about the fact that we are talking about marginalization, because even if someone's numbers don't look underrepresented, it doesn't mean they're not having an inequitable experience. And so I think marginalization focuses more on the quality of experience someone's having, which I think is, if you focus on that, the numbers kind of follow.
I mean, not to blow too much smoke your way, but I think a lot of the time when I reflect on like who are the major influences in my career on kind of enabling me to be a more equitable leader, I look back at the work that we did together at Culture Amp and my journey there and the impact that you individually had on me. And, so I think that language is all coming from one of the leaders in the world. And that's why if you're looking to kind of brush up on this sort of stuff and become a more inclusive leader, then Aubrey is definitely someone you should be following on LinkedIn and have various kind of socials, which we'll do plugs at the end. What do you think are some of the key things that you would want to be looking out for as like a candidate when you're trying to evaluate companies that are potentially active, let's say, because I think we can recognize that everyone has biases and that we're always kind of trying to support people in navigating these biases, the good and bad. But I think we probably want to pay even more attention to like the actively structured marginalization of groups. So like, how do you navigate that as a candidate and kind of, evaluate companies in that way, in that remit? We are delighted to be sponsored by Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations like interviews, intakes, and debriefs, and then provides a perfectly summarized note of everything that was discussed. That means that you can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. I've spoken to so many recruiters and recruiting leaders who are loving using Metaview across their organizations. It's saving them time, but it also means that they have more data to make better decisions. So for every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can now make confident and informed decisions, and recruiters can finally take control of the interview process. The impact on candidate experience is also massive. Since recruiters don't have to worry about taking notes in the moment, they can really focus on being present and engaged with you. Forward-thinking recruiters at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora are all leveling up their interviews with Metaview. So head on over to metaview.ai/open to work to get started for free on your first 5 calls.
Yeah, so I think there's like one of the things I never look for is like, does a company have a diversity statement on their website? And the reason is because it's really cheap to slap some words on a website. And so for me, there's kind of 2 different avenues of questions that I give to job seekers. And the first one is kind of structural, and it's like a ask your recruiter and they'll get back to you, which is like, can you give me some details about the equity and inclusion strategy at the company? What kind of programs are there? What inclusive benefits do you offer? I think those, like, your recruiter can get you HR knowledge of that. But I think if you're really trying to evaluate the inclusiveness of a culture, asking specific questions of your interviewers or hiring manager can be really helpful. So for me, thinking about our relationship is like one of the reasons Culture Amp was able to make so much progress when we were working together is because we had really open-minded people who had the desire to be inclusive, right? It's actually not hard to teach people to be inclusive if they already want to be. And so I like to ask hiring managers, tell me about a time where you did something exclusive or inequitable, and how did you figure that out, and what did you do differently the next time? Because my assumption is everybody's done something exclusive, right? I'm not looking for perfection, but the kind of leader that I want to work for, and for me, that I know I can coach, is one who has an indication and has shown that they've wanted to do better in the past, even if they're imperfect. And that to me is the strongest signal that you're going to be able to build that really trusting, inclusive relationship with someone. The second question that I like to ask is not, do you care about equity and inclusion? Because anyone can lie to you about that. But just say, what's something that you've done to make the workplace more equitable and inclusive? Because every single person should be able to talk about their contribution. And that could be something as simple as, I make sure that my colleagues aren't interrupted in meetings, all the way to, I demand pay equity audits for my department, right? So depending on the role, the answer will be different. But if someone can tell you an authentic story about how they've contributed, that's usually a pretty good signal.
I think that's super interesting because, like, immediately asking those questions, like, that would make some people uncomfortable. I think, putting the spade in the room, and some of these questions are a little bit uncomfortable. Like, tell me, that first one especially immediately was like, whoa, how would I respond to that question? That's like a really thought-provoking question. And I wonder if, depending, like, you are someone who has established an incredible career of having these conversations, and it takes a lot of confidence, candidly, to be able to ask someone that direct of a question. I mean, not everyone, from a historically marginalized groups or wherever you are in your career, depending on your level, et cetera, is going to be able to have the confidence to ask that sort of question.
Yeah. And I think you can, like, depending on your comfort level, you can switch it. Because for me, what I'm really looking for in that type of a question is like humility and curiosity, basically. Because if you don't have those, like, you can't really be an inclusive person. And so for me, even asking something, and it's fair as a job seeker for me to ask this as a candidate and someone to ask me, so I can ask the hiring manager, is like, where's a time that you didn't do as well as you wanted to in people management? What did that look like? And what did you learn? Right. And quite frankly, like, you don't want to work for anyone who isn't okay telling you that they haven't been perfect, right? Like, there's some ego problems there that are probably going to be not great for you. So I think if you're, like me, I am very direct in my job search, which is probably why I've gotten so few job offers in my career. But I think that asking questions that get you examples of those underlying qualities is what's going to be helpful. And I think it's important that you customize the language to something that feels authentic to you and that you feel comfortable asking. But anything that gets at humility and curiosity, I think, are good starts.
You've obviously had like a really impressive career. And I think a lot of people, and we were talking about this before the call, would like look at your career and think, well, that was beautifully plotted career that must have been planned. But that's very, very rarely the case. And you mentioned that you went through like loads of interviews and kind of been coaching people. Maybe tell us a little bit about kind of your individual experience in navigating kind of your job search as someone who comes from a historically marginalized group as well, and also how you've approached, you have a particular confidence and what you were looking for, particularly like some companies wouldn't have loved what you were putting down. And so how did you navigate that as well to get access to your job search?
Yeah. So I would say that like my career looks lovely in reverse, and I can tell you a story about, how I was strategic with everything, and it's just not true. My first job out of grad school, the company just happened to be looking for someone with expertise in a very narrow thing I had studied in grad school. So it was like pure luck that a local company needed someone who knew this very specific thing that like not many people knew about, who could write things. And I happened to have a journalism degree. So like accident. And then, my job at Atlassian, everyone's like, oh, that was so amazing that you got into Atlassian. I found out after I got hired that 3 other people had turned that job down. Like they had put offers out and had been rejected. So I was their 4th choice candidate. And I think I did okay in the role, but like really was not the top of the pile. And then with Culture Amp, they met a lot of the criteria that I wanted, but they met the most important one, which was I wanted to work for a leader who really valued the work of equity and really wanted someone who would hold him accountable for living his values. And so that kind of gets at the story I've told you, which was I spent about 2.5 years job searching. Atlassian was great, but I had been ready to move on a little bit before I actually left. And I had the privilege to not feel pressure to take a job because I had a job, but I got to the final round of, I think, 26 or 27 job processes. Wow. And when I was open with CEOs about the fact that, ethics are really important to me, like doing work in a really authentic way, that really held the organization accountable for fairness and for respect. I had a lot of CEOs who absolutely did not want to hire someone who did that. They wanted to hire a figurehead who did DEI PR. And so just being, a little bit dogmatic cost me a lot of career opportunities in a lot of way. And it was privilege that allowed me to do that. But you don't see that on my LinkedIn. Like you don't see the 2.5 years of interviews that I did. And so I think it's important to tell people that I think it's disingenuous to say like, oh, if you're just yourself, you'll get this most amazing job, because the reality is that I was a senior director at a 4,000 person international company, and my next job was a director at a 400 person company. And I love my job. I love the team. I'm so happy that I am where I am. But like on paper, people could read that as a step back because I was optimizing for something else. And so I just want to be honest with people that like there are trade-offs, and even something that looks really good on paper, there might be some failure behind the scenes that you're not always privy to.
Yeah, and I think there's a load of different levels that I wanted to follow up with there. I think one is like, I really resonate with that story of putting a challenge on the table and being your kind of authentic self, especially if you're in like a strategic leadership role with and speaking to a leadership team or a founder or a CEO. Whenever I interview for heads of TA roles or directors of TA roles where I'm leading the function in its entirety, I always put a challenge on the table to a leader in the business to say, I think we could improve our recruitment process by doing X. And this is my based on my experience and based on what the data says, or something like that. And because just purely to see how they'll react to that. Because if they're interested in coming to the table and having a conversation about why that might be the case, or why they've done it like that, or like engage in it, that is always a like, yes. But so many of the time, I would say like 70% of the time, they're like, no, too much faff. We've decided we're going to do it this way and you're not going to play ball. So we'll just leave it there. And when I tell this story to other people, they're like, why are you doing that? Don't you want the job? Like, go and change it from the inside. And I'm like, I want to know that I can come in and have a discussion with these people. And some of this stuff is like really fundamental. And I think recruitment and I think diversity and inclusion probably sits within the same category of like, people think they can do it better than you can, or think they already have the answers in lots of respects, or want you to do it in a very specific way that sits within a very specific box. And that's never a job that I really want to have. Yeah. And I think if you're kind of a candidate listening to this, some like kind of reflecting on some of the takeaways is, it's important to have your hierarchy of needs, right? Whenever you start a job search, and as you're going through that job search, to continue to reiterate what it is that you are looking to get from that search. Like, what is it that you're looking to achieve? What is it that you want in your kind of not your next immediate role, potentially even, but like kind of further down the track, and create a way to, and it's like almost like a scorecard to evaluate companies. And it could be that you're really, really confident and clear with the mission and the vision and the values, and that's what's most important to you. But it could be that for someone else, it's about kind of getting, a minimum amount of money through the door, or like, just being able to get any job as quickly as possible and like a contract or whatever. And everyone's needs will look different, but I think it's really important to evaluate what those needs are and consistently iterate against those so that you can make a decision that is right for you at the end of the day. So, Aubrey and I challenging a CEO on how they think about diversity inclusion recruiting is not going to be right for someone else who doesn't hold those same values and interests. And like, that's okay as well, because that's perfectly valid to your like individual situation, but only you will know that. And it's important to have that written down. Otherwise you kind of expose yourself to jumping into something that isn't going to fulfill kind of some of your basic needs or some of the things you're looking for, even short or long term. What advice would you give in kind of for the current, in this current world? Because obviously 2019, 2020 was a very, very different kind of job era than we are in right now. What advice would you give to people, especially those who are coming from historically marginalized groups?
I would say being really clear in articulating, especially the like extra skills that you have. Number one. So I find that in an era where companies are forced to do more with less, like coming in with what I call like a wild card skill is super important. For me, it's like I'm a trained writer, which is not necessarily something that you're looking for in your HR leader, but like, hey, I can do comms really quickly with, a lot of independence. Or, hey, I have like an HR manager who's worked as a bartender, to me is really interesting. Or like if you're coming into sales, but you were a waitress, like you should talk about that. And that's kind of related to the other thing is I see a lot of people who come from historically marginalized backgrounds who have developed incredible skills outside of the work context, and they think they can't talk about them because they didn't get paid to develop them. So like I think about the example of like a single mom with 2 kids. Like you could talk about that as like, I have been a stellar parent to my 2 kids, which is true, but it likely also means that you're an exceptional manager of a P&L and can manage very difficult stakeholders under time constraints. Both of those things are true. And so like, I would just really encourage people that sometimes you have to learn to talk about your brilliance in ways that the receiver will understand. But for example, a lot of people don't speak English at home, right? They're speaking English as a second language. And why would you not talk about that as something that makes you amazing as a candidate? Fluent in cross-cultural communication, right? It's not just, I don't speak English fluently. You probably actually are amazing, but that you have this ability to translate between cultures that another candidate might not. And so that's what I would say is like lean into what makes you unique, because your marginalization has likely also caused you to develop skills that make you an even more competitive candidate. And so workshop how to talk about those things in a way that makes them sound as amazing as they are. It's really easy to see like your experiences of marginalization as a deficit, and like not to say that that isn't true, but there's also a way to recognize the exceptional skill that it's given you that someone who does not experience your marginalization doesn't have, whether that's knowledge that someone doesn't have or a skill that they didn't develop. And so I think it's both important from a personal empowerment perspective, but it's also an opportunity for you to educate a hiring manager or a hiring leader about the ways that you are special and unique that other candidates might not. And so how do you turn something that you could view as a disadvantage into something that shows why you're exceptional?
Yeah. And I think first this is like hot off the press, like first time we've had someone talk about this sort of stuff in the Open to Work podcast series, which is awesome. So I love that we've got like new, fantastic advice that can service, really anyone around the world. But I think if you take like a really basic example of, someone who's coming out of university and you're going for maybe a sales role or just any kind of graduate job, even if you like, if you've gone to a tier 1 university, great. But if you haven't gone to a tier 1 university, but have also like paid your way through university through like working like shifts in your own retail or a bar or whatever to help fund, that is super impressive and really interesting. And especially kind of sitting next to someone who might not have done that, that is an advantage. And that is something that lots of companies would, and lots of employers would find very, very impressive, because you've, been able to back against the wall. You've had this incredible resilience to go and achieve something truly extraordinary without really any support or safety net. And if I was thinking about like what sort of salesperson I would rather hire, that would be really high on my list. Or if I'm working in a startup, again, like these sorts of things, like those sorts of traits that you're displaying through having gone through that experience, very, very high on my list. To your point of like managing your time, P&L, super smart, have to like, your resilience, playing to your strengths here, and not where kind of the society has told you they are weaknesses. They are not. They are absolutely your strengths.
Yeah. And I think it's, you have an opportunity. Don't wait for someone to ask you about it. Walk in, asserting and telling the story of why that's amazing. Because, right, to your point, I mean, we've both been in startups that, like, if I look at someone who maybe had a lower grade point average but worked a second job, I think that person's going to succeed in the workplace more than necessary. Not that someone with a high GPA wouldn't, but they haven't shown that they can manage multiple priorities in the same way. And so it's on you to say, actually, let me tell you about what this experience taught me and why I think it creates value for your company, and like lean into that and be proud of that experience. Because I will tell you, as someone who's hired a ton of people, those people, the people who come in and can tell you specifically about their lived experience and how it's given them a particular skill or point of view, are the most interesting hires and often create the most impact. But, if you're not trained to look at people that way, which my assumption is most people aren't, it's on the candidate to do the narrative building that helps that hiring leader understand.
I mean, and this ties back to how we launch every single episode of the podcast, right? It's that tell me about yourself question. We talk about this as like potential, like it's a weird question to ask still in the modern age of recruiting, but it's a potential open goal, right? It's an opportunity to own this narrative. It's an opportunity to play into someone's biases, understand what they're looking for, and then pitch to that specifically. And this is the platform which you can start by like turning someone's perception of you in their heads immediately, if they might have one, or like speaking to this sort of experience and this narrative in a way that they weren't necessarily expecting. And so if you get asked that question, you have this interesting background, like absolutely prepare a response that is going to be able to speak to your like unique, fantastic impact that you've had through your life and through your lived experience that's not just professional. And I think we too often forget that. And even when I think back on my coaching of execs and stuff like that as well, like I very rarely ask them to start with a values-led answer. And that's something that you did right at the top. And I think that obviously is relevant to what you do. But when I think about even in a scenario where I was coaching a sales leader recently, I was like, the reality is if you go and speak to a CRO, they're not going to care about that as the top of your question. You're going to have to talk about your results first and get to that later. But I think that, you could absolutely play it the other way around if depending on the audience you were speaking to. And that was that person's unique selling point in lots of respects. So like we found a way to weave it in. But I think it's so important to lean into the unique impact that you can have, regardless of what stage of your career. And if you come from if you have an interesting background, that's the opportunity to platform it. So when we worked together, we built like we started to build a really interesting and equitably designed recruitment process, which we still talk about today. And I think is my understanding, it's still being used at Culture to a certain extent as well. And there are a lot of recruiters that listen to this. And I wonder kind of what advice, if you'd be able to tell them a little bit about kind of what you've built so far, what the team has built so far at Culture Amp, and what advice you would give to build a more equitably designed recruitment process.
Yeah, so I think the first and most important thing is data. Like you have to collect data in a legal way. And if folks are interested in inspo, you should check out the Culture Amp job ads, because we don't just give candidates the option to give us data. We actually give them a video that explains to them why we want the data, about the fact that we do care about equitable recruiting, and it helps us do that. It skyrockets our response rates because people have more confidence in the process. So free, anybody can do that. And then I think the work that we did together actually comes down to adding more structure as a first priority. So we know that unstructured interviews not only aren't very predictive of whether someone can do the job, they let bias creep in a whole lot of different ways. And so the more, again, prep and pre-work you can do to be really clear about what skills you're looking for a particular role, and then applying that kind of rubric to every candidate, I think is really important. I also think there's work that we do at Culture Amp where for roles where we see a significant amount of underrepresentation, we intentionally spend time up front sourcing candidates from those marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds. So we don't make it impossible for anyone to apply. That isn't legal. But what we do is we put intentional effort into making sure that we have a balanced slate of candidates to consider for each role. Some cheat sheet for you is if you have one person from a marginalized background in your recruitment process, 0% likelihood they will get hired. If you have two, that chance jumps to 40, no matter how many other candidates are on the slate. So if you're thinking about like, what's the threshold I need to meet, at least two people from underrepresented and or historically marginalized groups is what you should be looking for, usually at the phone screen or hiring leader stage, if your hiring leader interview is front loaded. So that was a lot of the work we did. We also, since you left, we did a lot of work around the actual hiring principles at Culture Amp, and we share these with every hiring leader. And one of those is that we prioritize quality and diversity over speed. So we made an intentional decision that we believe quality and diversity move together, but we will slow down a hiring process to help make it more equitable and help make the company more representative. And that was a priority that was endorsed from the top all the way down. And so I have found that makes it much easier for our incredible talent partners to go out and source that diverse pool of candidates, because they have automatic permission to take their time to do a really good job. And so those are some things that I would say, none of those probably sound like they're big ticket, big budget items. And the reason is they're not. They're completely implementable by any organization. And what you see, and I think this is the most important thing, is what is more equitable is also better for performance and common sense recruiting. So it's not a big extra thing. Often just doing things really well and really structured leads to fairer outcomes, which ultimately I think is something we can all agree is a good thing.
So Aubrey, I'm going to ask you one final question that is left to us by the previous guest. So if you could change one thing about the way we as a society hire people, what would you change?
Stop caring about people's pedigrees and how fancy the name on their degree is. Get rid of it.
Yeah. Yes. I love that. What a simple and eloquent answer. What do you want to back that up, or is that just like enough of a beautiful little soundbite and we want to leave it there?
To be honest, speaking as someone who went to Stanford, which is one of those schools that people think is really fancy, none of the smartest people I've ever met have gone to an elite university. And I've met a lot of smart people, like I'm in HR, so I talk to people all the time. And the most interesting, impressive, and talented people almost always came from much more non-traditional backgrounds. And so I think we just lose out on so much amazingness in the world because those kind of titles and fancy things tend to be just a proxy for privilege. It's not actually a proxy for potential or talent or anything like that. And so I feel like it's really important for me as someone who does have the fancy name on the degree to be like, it doesn't actually mean shit. Go find something more interesting about someone.
Awesome. What a fantastic way to wrap up the podcast. Aubrey, where can people find you if they want to learn more?
On my digital soapbox, I hang out on LinkedIn quite a bit, and I have a funny name, so I'm easy to find. But I am constantly writing about sort of talent, equity at work, things like that. So if people are interested in my opinions, I'm happy to share them.
And fully endorsed by me as well. In the meantime, if you are looking for work, please, like and subscribe and give us comment and feedback and write in if you have questions for our guests, opentoworkpod@gmail.com. And, we're here to help you, right? So if there's topics that we haven't supported you on so far, then please email us and share with your friends who are also looking for work so that we can kind of help them guide through this really challenging job market that's kind of just getting harder, it feels like at the moment. So if we can do anything to help, obviously we're here. So until next time, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. You can see us on LinkedIn, email us, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. That was so much fun.